Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Kramer. I'm Senior Fellow for Western Balkans here at the European Value Center for Security Policy in Prague, Czechia. And I'm very excited to be with you all today to have the official launch and subsequent discussion of vulnerability towards authoritarian foreign influence in the Western Balkans. It's a report that's been put together by a number of organizations, not just simply in the Balkans, but this time in cooperation with organizations in Hungary and Czechia, which gives it to me a special flavor and a special insight. And we're happy to be sharing the results of this report with you today. I find this report to be especially unique in three respects. And I hope that if you have not already taken the time to read it, you will by visiting the European Value Center's website and downloading it yourself. But first, it is a report that provides not only a distinct methodology, but in particular, a ranking system of three countries that are pivotal to not only the future of the region, but also for Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance, namely Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. And what this ranking system allows is a more economical and, if you will, concise view in understanding the way that authoritarian actors have been intervening into the societies, the polity, and the economy of these three states. Thus far, I have yet to see any report that is focused on malign foreign influence in such a way that provides us with both shall we say, a quantitative representation of the qualified research that's put forward in this report. Secondly, most of the literature that I have read in recent years out there that focuses on malign foreign influence in the region is primarily focused on Russia and China. Indeed, these are the two most engaged actors, if you will, on this rather nefarious front. This report takes it a step further and considers other authoritarian states and their activities in these three countries, namely Turkey and, speaking broadly, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation States. And finally, as I alluded to with my initial remarks today, is that I'm excited by this report to see that there is a bridge that's being made in democratic civil society organizations that are focused on the issue of malign foreign intervention that is getting beyond just Southeastern Europe and Northeastern Europe, but rather that we're seeing a meeting of minds, interests, and expertise that spans the invisible border that really shouldn't be there, because we're dealing with common threats that, while unique to each country and each society, have common tactics and common ends that need to be considered in a more holistic and cohesive manner. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. I'm going to do so in the order by which they will be presenting. After they do, I will, of course, give a couple of questions, and we'll be opening up to broader inquiries coming from the audience, that is you today, vis-a-vis the Slido, link, which is beneath your YouTube screen if you're watching right now. Dr. Peter Krecko is the Executive Director of Political Capital Institute and a non-resident associate fellow at the Johns Hopkins University SAIS Bologna Institute for Policy Research. His work primarily focuses on authoritarian influence, political populism, and extremism in Europe. In 2016 and 2017, he was an associate professor at the Central Eurasian Studies Department at Indiana University and has co-authored one book on Hungary's far right and has authored a second on fake news and conspiracy theories. Barbara Hrjova is a program manager at the Prague Security Studies Institute, leading the Western Balkans Crossroad Project. Barbara is a PhD candidate at the Institute of International Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University in Prague, where her research revolves around the politics of memory and identity within historical narratives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She is also a policy officer at the Consortium of Migrant Assisting Organizations, where she deals with Czech migration and integration policies and advocates for the rights of foreigners living in the Czech Republic. Marko Pankovsky is a researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje, and is a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund's 2020 Rethink program. Marco's research interests evolve around the relationship between the foundations of good governance, public administration reform, and European security. He's also served in a research capacity at the Swedish Defense University in Stockholm. Ivana Stradner is currently a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where her research focuses on the intersection of international law and security. She has an LLM and a JSD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and an LLB from the faculty of the University of Belgrade. Prior to joining AEI, Dr. Stradner worked as a visiting scholar for Harvard University, a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland and the Lund University in Sweden. So, a prestigious lot. I'm excited that you're all here today, and we're all very much looking forward to hearing your remarks. Peter, I'll begin with you, please.
Thank you very much, Richard, and welcome everyone. And thanks for our other speakers for today as well, Marco, Ivana, and Barbara. I will be pretty brief also because sometimes I feel I have some problems with the connection, so let me know if you hear nothing of what I'm telling. I will be brief and quick, trying to deliver some introductory messages, and I would then let the real experts of the topic discuss in details what we have found in the study. And so first of all, why did we decide to do this research? There are quite a lot of vulnerability indexes out there, and I think they are important. And the logic of vulnerability is important to examine. On the other hand, the weaknesses of the mere focus of vulnerability in our assessment is that practically anything can be a vulnerability. If there is corruption in the country, if there are political divisions, if there are let's say high level of unemployment and so on, practically anything can be a vulnerability. Anything can make countries almost vulnerable to foreign malign influence. And what we try to assess in our methodology is more the active and existing ways of influence and infiltration into the countries of the Western Balkans and their subsystems by foreign authoritarian regimes. So we tried to quantify this kind of existing foreign authoritarian influence. And I would like to thank to our partners, European Values, National Endowment for Democracy, who supported us in this exercise, and also Institute for Democracy, Foreign Policy Initiative, and Center for Democratic Transition. So in a nutshell, we try to assess the foreign authoritarian influence in the three countries using a methodology, a pilot methodology that identified 5 ways of influence into the countries under discussions, but we found this methodology sound enough to be extended to other countries in the future as well. So the 5 dimensions are religious influence, political influence, public opinion, economic and technological influence, and education. And what we found is first of all, religion, which is usually not among the dimensions that we discuss in details when it comes to foreign interference, seems to be a pretty important factor in the Western Balkans in general, and in the 3 countries under discussions in particular. The local Orthodox Church is raising very strong pro-Russian voices in Montenegro and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, of course, in Republika Srpska mainly. And of course, this is a phenomenon that is well known in Serbia as well. But on the other hand, in countries where the Muslim minority is considerable, mainly Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also to a certain extent Macedonia and a bit Montenegro as well. Turkey and some Gulf states seem to be rather active in making religious ties and exert influence through this way as well. So we are not only talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, but also Muslim religion as well. So Second, when it comes to political influence, the political influence seems to be something rather widespread in all over these countries, with usually Russia having rather dominant role in Republika Srpska, in symbolic politics, but also in diplomatic ties. It has a role in Montenegro as well, while it strongly varies over time. But I think Montenegro will be a very interesting and actual topic to discuss after I finish my input. And we also talk about, of course, not only Russia, but other countries as well, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, for example. And what we found regarding political influence is that it's really important, on the one hand, for authoritarian countries to show up that they have their local allies in the Western Balkans. But of course, it can be very important as well for local politicians to show up that they have some important friends in big countries among superpowers. So it's here we have the push factors and the pull factors as well. Both are important. The attempts to influence the public opinion also is rather widespread. And given that we are talking about countries with rather small populations, small investment in changing the public opinion can have a very high impact through the media and through NGOs, for example. We found this attempt the strongest in Montenegro, the smallest country among the three, where Russia exerts an important influence through not only the Orthodox Church, but through the Serbian population and the infrastructure, the media infrastructure, and the organizations that are connected to them. And of course, it will be a topic under discussion as well, but we could see in the very heated electoral campaign in Montenegro as well that these influences are probably making an impact as well. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we saw this impact as well in Republika Srpska by Russia, but also by Turkey, for example, in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And third, in Macedonia, we can rather see a declining impact on the public opinion of malign superpowers, and especially Russia. If we take a look at the lack of success in the name dispute and the referendum, and also the lack of success of putting an obstacle in the way of the NATO accession of Macedonia, we can probably talk about Macedonia as a good example of how to push back foreign interference. And when it comes to economy, we found it as a rather important factor, and the most important influence, let's say most visible influence, we could see Montenegro against the smallest country, and not only through, for example, Chinese infrastructure investments and energy projects, but also through, for example, Russian tourism, which seems to have a very important impact on the country's economy. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we found that, for example, dependence from fossil fuels are very important. I mean, the country is practically totally dependent on Russian fossil fuels. And in North Macedonia, we could see that this economic impact is probably lower, but China is a rising actor in the scene. And in North Macedonia, in generally, we can see a rising role of China compared to Russia. And last and least, we found that education is the least important factor of influence in these countries, with two main players around. Turkey seems to have a very important role, especially in North Macedonia and Bosnia, in investing into education, and China through foreign exchanges and university cooperations and so on is also an important actor, but Russia does not seem to be important player here. And the very last point, and then I would give over the floor. One important message I think that our findings send is something that we less talk about. Of course, political influence is very important. Religious influence, all the factors we examined seems to be very important, but economy seems to be rather the key. So if we talk about pushing back malign foreign interference, the strategy of big countries in these small Western Balkan states seems to be that if they bring some money, some investment there, that doesn't cost too much to them, it can lead to a really huge impact. So probably the carrot in the hands of the Euro-Atlantic community seems to be the key in pushing back malign foreign influence. Thank you, and I would give back the floor to Richard and to ask the others to give their inputs.
Peter, thank you very much for that thorough breakdown of the 5 categories that were ranked within the report and the thinking behind each one of them and the findings that frames the rest of the discussion for this afternoon quite perfectly. So my gratitude. Barbara, please, if you would share your insights from this report and beyond, if you will.
Thank you, Richard. I hope you can all hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to present several observations that can be drawn from reading the recently published report. Some of them have been already highlighted by Peter, because the report brings useful overview of foreign illiberal powers leverage in the 3 Western Balkan states it describes. Its design and comparative nature enables for interesting insights in how the space for external meddling is being shaped by local vulnerabilities and how internal cleavages are exploited for increasing foreign powers' imprint in the region. So while the report shows that there are some common patterns identifiable in both external actors' approach and in local aspects, such as the lack of democratic control of leaders' accountability, it also shows that the situation is largely country-specific. And if we look at local factors that most crucially shape space for external engagements, then as Peter already mentioned, ethnic and religious composition of local population stand out, followed by a state of debate on the geopolitical orientation and other key socio-political cleavages or economic dependencies. Those are very visible as well. But all in all, the internal divisions become very often also the lines along which external actors are aligned in the region. And this is most clearly visible probably in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where Russia has close ties to Bosnian Serbs, while Turkey, and to a certain extent also the Gulf states, to Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims. Similarly, Muslim populations in all 3 countries tend to be most pro-Western, while Eastern Orthodox often see Russia as traditional partner and the bearer of important values. But it's also important to note here that this observation does not apply universally, because what the report shows is that it applies mostly to actors traditionally present in the region, mainly Russia, Turkey, or also the European states, because these countries draw on traditional alliances or religious and cultural affinities. But if we look at China, which has only limited history of mutual relations with the Western Balkan states, we see that it behaves rather differently in the region and is also perceived differently. Because it largely ignores local ethnic and religious issues or political cleavages, and it's perceived as a neutral actor which follows its economic aims and brings investments and opportunities to the Western Balkan states, like building infrastructure or saving bankrupting industries. So this being said, I think the awareness about the risks and pitfalls related to Chinese activities are still generally very low in the region. It's different among the expert community, but
standing by for Barbara to hopefully reconnect. Still standing by with bated breath. All right, well, in this instance, why don't we go back, Marco? Would you feel comfortable about commencing at this point? And if there's additional remarks that Barbara would like to make, we can hopefully address some of those during the Q&A session.
Yeah, sure. So
okay, great. So Marco, yes, based on my reading of the report, and Peter commented on it as well, comparatively, I mean, based on the ranking system, North Macedonia is looking good kind of throughout the region, and at any rate, and there's been some recent evidence to support that in the political sphere. So we're looking forward to hearing your remarks, not just on that aspect, but throughout all of the subject areas in the report's ranking. So please.
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, I would like actually to share three general findings from the report that actually reflect the situation in North Macedonia. Some of them you'll see that are confirmatory in their nature and reflect findings of studies and similar efforts conducted in the past, while of course adding further details in the debate. But some of them dig into processes and aspects that paint new shapes when we discuss authoritarian influence, also in North Macedonia. So first, I would say there is a gradual shift of authoritarian actors, change of scenery, if you like, meaning that Russian influence in North Macedonia is decreasing. Second, different actors apply different means of influence. And third, and for me personally, the most interesting one is that different actors conduct influence-seeking activities in different areas. And in the most cases, they do not overlap. So we determined that Russian influence is decreasing because we saw that three major anchors of Russian engagement, disinformation operations, siding with political actors and diplomatic activity, and economic activity, are actually, all these indicators are decreasing. So following its peak in the period before the name change referendum in September 2018 and the subsequent membership of North Macedonia in NATO, these activities decreased significantly, including even those measurable ones, like level of investments, for example. Actually, if you see the Russian infrastructure today, currently revolves mainly around this dubiously awarded gas pipeline in the 90s and Gazprom monopoly in this context, which should be frank, for North Macedonia currently is not a strong asset due to the limited gas consumption nationally and also the government plans for supply diversification. Also, it revolves around connections with fringe political parties that never go beyond the threshold of 1% nationally. And maybe their strongest asset in this regard is this piece of the information space that they own. But this mostly comes and originates from Serbia, and often there are local media outlets that often paid by businesses from Hungary, for example, which also shows the importance for the role of maybe proxy actors in the region, and maybe further similar reports that aim to assess authoritarian influence maybe should reflect on these countries as well. The second point I would like to make is that this report shows that different countries apply different tools of engagement. So we talk about Russia, and we can again see the tendency to utilize asymmetric and rather cheap methods, which does not involve high amount of net investments or aid compared to Turkey, and investments and loans compared to China, for example. Turkey is the biggest aid provider out of all the countries we looked upon. Actually, North Macedonia is in TICA's top 10 countries when it comes to aid. Turkey invests in construction projects, is present in the banking sector, donate military equipment, COVID-19 assistance recently, and significantly invest in education and mosque renovation projects. Education is especially important for Turkey, and the Turkish educational footprint by far exceeds the other countries of interest, of course, to a large extent due to the Turkish minority in the country and the historical relations, but still there is a strong politicized emphasis on this because of the Marif International School run by the Turkish Marif Foundation, which was, as probably know, established to assume the administration of overseas schools linked to FETÖ. Politically, Turkey tried to exert influence on North Macedonia for legal proceedings of 15 persons residing in North Macedonia. Turkey believes are affiliated to FETÖ, but the government refused to do so. And when we talk about entities from the Gulf countries, their influence is limited to investing in religion. And here it's interesting that compared, for example, to Turkish investments, these investments come from entities from the Gulf countries, not the official governments, and they're way less transparent, and this requires further attention. China, on the other hand, is almost completely dedicated to economic means of influence seeking, with the major loans for 2 highways that were provided with the condition that actually breached our commitment towards transparent procurement procedures. Other than that, no significant investments compared to Serbia, for example. And honestly, I think that the weak performance of Sinohydro here in North Macedonia and the corruption that revolved around the project deteriorated the image of China in the country, which will make difficult for any politician in the future to engage in similar endeavor, but you can never know. We couldn't detect any significant efforts for China to exert any political or soft power influence seeking. But as the experience of some Central European countries show, the economic engagement could only be a base for expanded influence infrastructure in the future. The 5G installation remains an issue of concern. The government recently announced its intention to amend the legislation to address this issue, but this remains to be seen. Finally, what we should do to address these processes? First, the UN and NATO should strengthen their strategic communication towards the region of the Western Balkans, clearly communicating the benefits to the Western Balkans in this process. However, this communication will not mean much if it's not followed by a strong and consistent commitment towards the European integration of the region. On the other hand, the local governments must set up a resilient institutional and political structure that will decrease the maneuvering space of current and future malign actors and will make the government capable to manage their incentive structure. In media, that means creating conditions for unhindered work of independent media outlets, means investing in media literacy and transparency in media ownership, including final beneficiary ownership. In economy and critical infrastructure, it means reapproaching our way of attracting foreign investment that now employs high level of discretion and untransparent state aid mechanisms that actually attract corrosive capital. In technology, that means that we need an updated legislation that will clearly map out criteria that will prevent untrusted vendors to infiltrate our markets and security systems. And in politics, finally, that means continuous involvement of the democratic processes, democratization of the electoral models, and democratization and financial transparency inside within the political parties. So I will stop here and looking forward for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Marco. I'm sorry. We're trying to see if Barbara can reconnect right now. Barbara, are you able to hear us? You were able to get, I believe, roughly halfway through your remarks or so.
Okay, I can hear you because everything seemed so normal here that I didn't realize I was off until I did not hear any reply
there was no
you.
flashing alarm or explosion that you were disconnected. I understand. With that, Marco was able to just help us deep dive a little bit into the research, particularly as you'd indicated in your own remarks. Each country needs to be viewed distinctly, and Marco was able to get into that a bit, highlighting, for example, the fact that Russia's efforts to sway public opinion and other means of targeted influence have been missing their mark. And perhaps if you might be able to talk a little bit, given your background on Bosnia, about what you have seen perhaps in recent years where there have been changes in respect to Bosnia's landscape, say the extent to which the Chinese have been, perhaps, on one level, the Chinese have been engaging economically in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Has that been playing out in a political sphere as well? Or based on your research, have you seen China so far keeping their influence to an economic realm without trying to get into politics too deeply?
Okay, so can you hear me now? Is it?
Yes.
Okay, I think that China's position in Bosnia and Herzegovina is very different from Serbia or other more important economies in the region, because Bosnia seems to lie rather at the outskirts of China's interests. So China's presence there is much lower, and China is not such a visible player in Bosnia. Its position is specific there because the neutrality, which I mentioned before, I'm not sure whether you hear that part or not, is specifically important in Bosnia, where the external alliances are very much aligned along the internal divisions. So then China has very unique position because all parties and all sides are open to deal with it. But in contrast to Serbia, for example, China has not pushed Bosnia into any political aspect so far, because what we see, for example, is alignment of or support of China's diplomatic policies by Serbia in voting in the UN or so on, support for China's policies in South China Sea or its territorial sovereignty over Tibet and policies towards Uyghurs and so on. In Bosnia, we cannot see this because China still has not developed so close links to Bosnian political elites, and I think it does not perceive the country as an influential player. So it mostly focuses on some economic projects like investments into thermal power plants, and the debate has mostly revolved about risks of China's investments in Bosnia, about possible negative environmental aspects. Also, China's investment into one coal plant, which is going in the opposite direction than the EU push for greener energy sources and so on. So it might be harmful for Bosnia and Herzegovina's environmental standards vis-a-vis the European integration path.
No, and that's an interesting angle that you bring up. I know that there's been a lot of concerns about environmental impact, for example, in Montenegro, in respect to the now commonly known highway to nowhere. And to the extent that that may be an issue in Macedonia as well, it could very well stand to have an impact on these countries' efforts to better integrate and eventually become members of the European Union. I'd like to talk a little bit about Turkey and the Gulf and Bosnia as well, but I'm going to sort of save that so we can kind of stay on track here and give Ivana an opportunity to share her insights and her remarks right now, and then we'll circle back and perhaps dig into some aspects of the report a little deeper. And hopefully we were able to get a good chunk of your presentation before you were unfortunately cut off. So those parts that we didn't get to explore, I hope we're going to be able to do so in the discussion. Ivana, please, if you would kind of wrap this up all together and mention talking a little bit about Serbia as well, and as part of a greater Western Balkan context of foreign influence, that would be great.
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you so much for your kind invitation. And I just finished reading this report, and what a great really report that has established this Foreign Authoritarian Influence Index that measures hostile influence by authoritarian states. So for anyone who is interested in the Western Balkans and malign influence, I highly recommend to read this report, definitely. But I would like to actually start with my main concern, which is about the prospects and why should West actually care about the Western Balkans? Because oftentimes what I hear is in the United States, the Trump administration specifically has its own priorities, but also European Union has its own problems currently. So why should West actually care about the Western Balkans? I think it's a vital interest really to expose those authoritarian states and their influences in the region, because nowadays when the United States and European Union have their own security challenges, they certainly have less capacity to pay attention to the region, which is exactly what China and Russia want. They've been filling this power vacuum for years, especially Russia. And that's a very problematic thing, because what I've been writing and emphasizing is that it's actually in the interest of the West to counter influence by authoritarian regimes in the Balkans. Why? Well, the Balkans, certainly it's a linking bridge between West and East. The Balkans is considered to be the soft underbelly of Europe. And we have seen, we saw already in the past what happened when security in the Balkans is under threat, because instability in the Balkans easily translates into fragile Europe. And we know that destabilized Europe means also instead the United States. So I'm quite concerned about the fact that a lot of policymakers in the West don't understand the importance of the Western Balkans as such. And why is that again important? Because with the revanchist Russian rising China in the West cannot actually afford to have another problems in the region. And this is why the United States and European Union, let's put it this way, the West in general, absolutely needs a new strategy for the Balkans. I would like to briefly talk about this report, maybe to provide a bird's eye view and why winning hearts and minds in the Balkans have been quite successful. While it is very fashionable nowadays to talk about China, and I understand why. Russia certainly is probably less of a threat than China to the West, but it's still a very, very important threat in the Western Balkans. So let me just briefly emphasize what Russia has been doing in the region, because it's a great example why soft power and winning hearts and minds actually work. So maybe from a geopolitical point of view, the region, let's put it this way, is a shield from the threat of spreading from Western countries. This is how Russia is perceiving the region. And basically their main goal, the Moscow has a goal to hinder the EU enlargement, but especially NATO enlargement. So maybe I would say that Russia's goal actually is not survival, but rather a regional hegemony. And again, Russia understands that traditional warfare is passé, and by spreading fake news, misinformation, and propaganda, it actually reinvents reality. And in the case maybe of Montenegro, it precisely shows the power of religious influence that's happening nowadays. If you speak with people in the Balkans, oftentimes I hear that there is lack of faith in institutions and democracy, and there is this rise of cynicism and populism. And that's precisely what the Kremlin wants, because lack of faith in a democratic process is precisely what allows them to preserve the status quo and frozen conflicts in the region. And this is why I think Russia's soft power has been quite successful in the region, not only in religious affairs, but also what your report emphasized: political influence, public opinion, influence, economic, energy, technology, education, etc. But one thing that I think we should also emphasize is how Russia defines soft power. I think it's a very different concept than the one that Joseph Nye thinks about. I think the Russian interpretation of soft power is very much in alignment with very pragmatic approach. So for example, if you read the Russian foreign policy concept from 2016, it also emphasizes soft power as an integral part of efforts to achieve foreign policy objectives in Russia. We already mentioned that Russian influence is cheap, but it's also very hard to detect, I think, in the Balkans, especially in Serbia and especially in Republika Srpska, where you encounter a very friendly environment. One thing that Barbara emphasized is how Russia differs from China in its policy objectives, because Russia does not need to invest a lot, even though it's largely been perceived in Serbia in particular as a higher investor than European Union, for example. But like they have, I think, two main objectives when it comes to soft power. It is to promote Orthodox Brotherhood and to emphasize that Russia is actually the biggest ally in Serbia. So I would say that maybe the methods of diplomacy by China and Russia differ. But let me put this in the context of Serbia. So Serbia, I think, has largely been served as a main Russian ally, even though right now in current Serbian media, they're portraying themselves like trying to put like the Serbian government is moving forward more towards West than Russia, and that's natural because Russia's allies are actually different actors than only Vučić. But that's exactly also what Russia wants, like to have a very dichotomy within the region, within the actors. Like they, for example, they used a narrative of, again, Brotherhood and Orthodox religion, like in Serbia, which translates right now in Montenegro, that I would like to maybe later on discuss with you, and how it has been a very powerful weapon. Needless to say, also from the security perspective, that they use like a soft power through humanitarian center, etc., to influence the politics in Serbia. But one thing that I would also like to emphasize is what the West actually understands with the DFC opening the office in Serbia is, again, that economic influence is also tremendously important. Because that's one of the ways that you can actually promote democratic processes. We are going to see what's going to happen in the future with this Kosovo-Serbia agreement, especially because it asks Serbia for energy diversification. It asks Serbia for 5G networks. So one interesting thing that we will see about relationship between Russia and Serbia, but also Russia and China, and how it feels for China to play in the Russian backyard in Serbia. So we will see, especially in the spring, I think in Serbia, when it comes to 5G network, what's going to happen and how it's going to influence relationship between Serbia, Russia and China, because information is a powerful tool, and yeah, information is quite a powerful tool, and that's the main objective, I think, of China, that it has been using Serbia as a technological lab for its own technological purposes in the region. So I would like to maybe conclude again with the question that we absolutely need to think about the new strategy for the Western Balkans and how the West can counter those influences.
Great question to ask, Ivana, and it's a good one to lead into our discussion. I'm going to try to take a couple sort of kind of macro considerations that I've taken away from reading the reporting remarks today, and hopefully afford our audience today a little bit of clarification, not just for them, but for myself on those. And then you know, we can turn perhaps a little bit more into, one, of course, the questions that are coming in from our viewers, and secondly, maybe on a bit more of a micro or country to country level. And you know, the first one is, you know, when those, you know, sat down and you know, Peter and Marco, you know, others who contributed to this report, when you first sat down and looked at it, there was a question of, okay, so you defined certain states in this instance as being authoritarian, and you know, one of our viewers today had, and Marco touched on this a little bit, but one of our viewers has said, well, okay, but what about those anti-democratic elements in Hungary that have taken their share of North Macedonian media, and what does that mean? You know, I would look at a country, you know, Barbara, I would look at a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we can see that there are definitely non-state anti-democratic actors that wield a significant degree of influence. As we like to say, they punch above their weight in that country as well. And you know, it'd be helpful if you could talk a little bit about how you dealt with that issue when you were looking at state versus non-state actors, when you were choosing the three foreign malign influencers in the three target countries, and sort of within that consideration, also looking at, you know, Marco, you talked a little bit about Turkey and GCC in North Macedonia and a little bit elsewhere. It's sort of, well, they're there. You know, Turkey's come into the education scene largely to kind of shut down the Fethullah Gulen schools and the influence that they believe that they had amongst the Macedonian population. You know, the GCC investors, obviously in Serbia and elsewhere, have put a lot of money into commercial properties. You know, I'm sure I'm not going to be the first one who's going to argue against identifying Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan as being an authoritarian state, and the GCC monarchies pretty much they tick all the boxes as well. But their investments there then and their engagements, you know, when do we start to cross the line between what is benign and what is malign? So I want to just kind of put that out there for response. Again, just kind of sum it up. How are you looking at non-state actors as distinct from state actors when they are actually having influence on a country's democratic trajectory? And those state actors that you identified, when did you consider their influence to cross the line from benign to malign? Maybe Peter, do you want to try to take that one first? Did you unmute, Peter?
Sorry for that. Yeah,
that's
so
all right.
Thanks for your questions. I was just thinking about good responses. Let me start a bit with Hungary, and then I would comment on the more general questions as well. I think in the case of Hungary, we can observe a phenomenon that is about an EU and NATO member state, but a small country in Central Eastern Europe, trying to use similar methods that authoritarian superpowers do to influence politics and economics in countries in the Western Balkans. And yes, in North Macedonia, Hungary has been pretty active, especially in the Gruevski era, making alliances, but not necessarily on a bilateral level, but with specific political actors. And right now, VMRO seems to be a very important partner for the Orban government and not the Macedonian government. We could see efforts to, and also, yeah, the influence in the media were pretty much present. Also, there have been efforts to strengthen relationship, not with Bosnia and Herzegovina, but with Republika Srpska. So the diplomacy rather went to an entity level and not to a state level. And yes, I do think, and with Montenegro, we could see some let's say efforts of influence as well. So I do think that the tools that we highlighted here, and I do think that the methods that were highlighted here can be used by other countries as well. And I think as we like it or not, we are, I think, heading towards a more multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, the actors that want to influence political processes can be pretty broad, including a country of 10 million as well. So I think it's a very important and good point to raise. Of course, I mean, when it comes to Hungarian influence, it cannot compete with the Chinese, with the Russian, with the Turkish. So size does matter in this context. And when it comes to the influence of state and non-state actors, I think the patterns we try to identify here are rather, let's say, in the interconnection of the two. So I think if we even talk about, yes, let's say influence in education, influence in the energy sector, influence in the infrastructure sectors, technically in a lot of cases these are private companies that are, or entities and NGOs that are doing the work. But on the other hand, in the case of authoritarian countries, I think you have a stronger relationship generally between the actors that can exert influence outside the country's borders and the state themselves. So I think why we should separate, I think we have to, we also have to see this kind of connections between state and non-state actors that I think in case of authoritarian superpowers is simply stronger than in case of democracies. That's why I don't think the nature of, let's say, the influence coming from the United States is the same than the influence coming from authoritarian countries, because I think these interconnections are stronger and the power vertical is stronger in authoritarian states.
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Essentially, if you have a closed or semi-closed society, then indeed the centralization of power is going to really diminish the idea that you have a certain media holding group or a certain company that's engaging in a country without the complicit approval, if not outright support of given authoritarian government because of the nature of the power structures in that closed society. Thank you for that clarification. Oh, maybe I'll turn, if I could, to Marco and Barbara for a second. You know, I touched a little bit on this idea of like, you know, what is it when, you know, when
it's relatively low. So,
live streaming is on.
So actually, what we see that even an investment which in some country will not be regarded as political and will not have prime ministers present. In North Macedonia, you have directly the prime minister engaged as something that is important and is promoted as Turkish investments with all these flags and symbolism, you know. And actually, this also, when you compare this to the overall economic output, these investments are important. And that's why I also mentioned that it's really, really important how we approach these potential investors. And if some investment is regarded as really important, often these investments occur in behind closed curtains. They have a lot of discretion and so on, which makes you feel that some rules are maybe overlooked there. And this provides also, this goes beyond these legitimate investments and makes you think that okay, maybe this is a corrosive capital, and maybe these investments could be utilized for for political means, not only economic means. For example, also what we looked in the report is that if we talk about Turkey and their, for example, influence in the banking sector, it's their state-owned bank. The Halk Bank is state-owned bank. They merged with another state-owned bank that was present here, and for example, they invested in putting a commercial of the new school that when they replaced the FETO one before, the bank invested in that. The bank bought the picture in the city squares. You will see that actually maybe the bank is not only here for economic transactions, but they also want to show back home that they are committed to the political ambitions of the Turkish leadership. And we found upon many investments as such. For example, if we see about Chinese investments in the major highways, so that actually they came with their own procurement rules, for example. And it turned out later that a really high level officials were involved in dealing with this, with presumably commissions and so on. So you see the level of high political engagement when agreeing with these investments makes them more than just economic legitimate investments, and I think that they should be under our radar.
Thank you. Barbara, are you with us still?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are. Yeah,
My
absolutely.
connection seems to be quite unstable, but I can hear most of what's being said.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for raising these questions, because actually that was something I touched upon at the end of my talk, which you missed.
Okay, good.
Because I think it would be too easy to label all Russian, Turkish, or Chinese activities as malign. And I think we need to differentiate between what is malign, what is not, and we need to also differentiate between the role of state actors and non-state actors. I do agree with what Peter said about much narrower space between state and non-governmental actors in authoritarian regimes. But still, I think we should not disregard that there is some space in between them, and we should make sure that we do understand the connection between those players properly, meaning we should really study these actors, their networks and links in depth. Are you still following me, or?
Yes, you're still here. Yeah, you're loud and clear.
And I think this is tasks for all of us who are analyzing the situation in the Balkans to really go in depth and describe the mechanisms of influence, try to investigate financial flows and networks and so on. Then following up on what Marco said, generally where the alert should be raised is when contracts with foreign companies and so on are accompanied by lack of transparency, which is often the case of Chinese or Russian or Gulf states investments. So this is something which is always attract our attention, because then we know that there is a lot of things going behind which is not accessible to public control. And I think that's one general rule that can be used for identifying potentially harmful areas and developments. So that's I think from me. I think there's significant task ahead of us.
Oh, there's absolutely that, and you know that brings me to Ivana, and you know, Ivana, I thought you began your remarks brilliantly, if I may, and I'm not exaggerating, because very often those of us that work in whatever your respective region may be, well, obviously it's important because you work on it, and you forget about the fact that there's an audience out here that whether it's those that they're simply interested because they want to know about the world around them and current events, or policymakers in Washington that I've spent my own time trying to convince about the importance of this region, along with my colleagues and friends there in America's capital. And I would like to sort of emphasize or share an anecdote talking with my colleagues here in European Values today. A sense of who's going to watch, and it's going to be a lot of people from Czechia and possibly from elsewhere here in V4 countries, and thinking about well, Balkans, if there's not a war, or if it doesn't have to do with Kosovo and Serbia, hopefully finding some way to coexist, there really isn't a whole lot that people are giving due consideration to. And it's I have continued to talk about the importance in a variety of forums of the transatlantic community, particularly in respect to NATO and our security, and how easily that can be taken for granted, and how easily a situation can change in a given country. And for example, someone who may be in Czechia or in Britain or the Netherlands or elsewhere, who may be concerned about transatlantic security, might not think that much about, say, a country like Montenegro, and it's roughly 650,000 people, except for the fact that based on my own research conducted with our friend and colleague Raif Bajrović and Ambassador Vesko Garcević back in 2018, so much of what happened in Montenegro was out of Russia's desire to have a warm water port on the Adriatic Sea, which has implications for all Mediterranean states, not to mention the entire NATO alliance. And these real estate and of course in geopolitics is everything, and that's something that I believe that this kind of report can help highlight for people when they understand why these countries are important to who are currently the major superpowers. With that that was my sort of way of saying, in case you missed it, Montenegro is very important. And also in case you missed it, just because a country is a NATO member, that does not mean they will be a NATO member forever. A government can come into power, and if in there long enough with sufficient support, can say, you know what, this was nice, but we're going to move on. And that's going to have implications for the entire alliance, and certainly for the security concerns, and that includes immigration concerns for Southeastern Europe. So let's turn to Montenegro for a second. Those of you that worked on this report, it's again, I sat down and I tallied all the results, and when you add them up and you average them out, Montenegro, based on the report's findings, is the country that collectively is most vulnerable to malign foreign influence at this juncture. And to answer a question that came from the audience, this report came out more recently, but certainly before the elections that occurred it was completed before the elections on October 30. And helpful would be, I think, to hear from you, Ivana, what your thoughts are about in the context of malign foreign influence. Where's the trajectory of Montenegro going right now, especially when we were able to see just how much power Amofil Radović had and the Serbian Orthodox Church had in mobilizing people to get out and vote, and really how easy it is to kind of derail an EU accession process by simply just doing nothing administratively or bureaucratically. I'm indicating I have my own concerns, but I'd like to hear what you think about what we may or may not be seeing in Montenegro in the short to medium term future.
Thank you so much for raising the question of Montenegro, because also when I read this report, I was very, very surprised, but actually not surprised to see that actually maybe Montenegro is one of the most vulnerable countries among the countries that you discussed here. And for many, many years, people thought, oh, Montenegro is going on the right path. They joined NATO. It's on the right path towards European Union. But if you actually take a step back and if you take a look, like also you wrote that report with Rauf, what Russia has been doing in Montenegro, it was a very, very good indicator that that actually Montenegro is not going in the right direction. So let me give you an example with what Russia is doing through Orthodox Church in Montenegro, which is a great example of soft power and religious influence. So Russia certainly, the Kremlin absolutely exploits like religious and cultural leverage through the Orthodox Church. And it absolutely mobilized the Orthodox Church in Montenegro through the Serbian Orthodox Church, because it's one of the best actually weapons to unite this Slavic world under Russian hat, under Russian roof. So what I like to say right now, a lot of people are celebrating the winning of pro-Serbia, pro-Russia alliance opposition, because they consider that to be like a new democratic coalition. But what I genuinely worry about is, you just mentioned the impact of Metropolitan Radovic and Serbian Orthodox Church and how they actually helped the coalition. But this is not the first time that actually happened. If you take a look at 2006, when Montenegro decided to push for independence, in 2016 and accession to NATO, you will be actually very, very surprised to see what Serbian Orthodox Church even did back then. For example, Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill, back then, he raised very, very serious concerns about the prospects of NATO in 2016. Then, for example, if you take a look at Serbian Patriarch Kinire, he invoked this memory where he emphasized, we are one nation, although we are divided. And a very similar narrative is actually happening right now within that same framework. I'm not, when you ask me where I think that Montenegro is going, a lot of people, they express their concerns that this new pro-Serbian, pro-Russian coalition might actually put out of NATO, and I don't think that they are going to do that. Why? It's a wonderful opportunity for Russia to have actually another ally within NATO, so they can exploit very sensitive information and have access to information. So I wouldn't be also surprised if they push towards European Union enlargement. So yeah, that's about Montenegro.
So a very interesting take. Basically, it could conceivably be tacitly accepted of the idea that it would be a backdoor for the Kremlin into NATO security and other transatlantic institutions. We're getting some questions from the audience, and I'm going to get to some of those. Well, I mean, actually, I've been trying to integrate those questions throughout. Those of you who are watching, I am paying attention to some of the inquiries that you're putting out there. But one thing that's come up from all of your remarks, and certainly from the report, is that there are different ways that obviously that Russia and China are engaging. And Ivana, you spoke a bit about what I believe is sort of that Russia's interest is having a destabilized Southeastern Europe that's unable to effectively integrate with transatlantic institutions as a consequence of that instability. China's not really as excited about that, because China wants everything to be as copacetic as possible so it can intervene economically as much as it would like. And Marco, you talked about it. Like, yeah, the problem is that when you don't have democratic institutions that are committed to transparency and accountability, then the public is sort of left wondering whether or not a deal that was brokered within the economic sphere was above board or not, and it weakened the country's democratic trajectory overall. So what I'm trying to get at is, although they have somewhat different interests, it's not that they don't align. And to the extent that there's a lack of confidence in democratic institutions, societies are semi-closed, they have semi-authoritarian, if not outright authoritarian rulers, that benefits both Beijing and the Kremlin, despite some places where their strategies or their intended outcomes for the region differ. So that all leads up to, are we seeing, or do you believe that we will increasingly see a Russia-China nexus where there's a greater level of coordination and cooperation in recognizing that, for example, China's just not going to have the soft power that Russia does in the Western Balkans. They can't, for a lot of reasons that we noted. The Orthodox Church and historical and cultural affiliations being a big one. But Russia has its own economic problems, and it's not about to engage in in hefty telecommunication or infrastructure programs in the Western Balkans simply because it has its own domestic and other global policy concerns. Is the environment right for them to start working together? Is that even feasible? Or is that something that we can talk about it now, but maybe in a couple of years from now, their interests and their resources just aren't going to align enough where we could expect to see a nexus in the region? That's for anyone to answer.
Yeah, I made briefly. Yeah, it's hard to say, but honestly, I think short term there will be no centralized coordination. I think that the actors will just see the situation on the ground and they will adjust their strategy according to what's needed currently. For example, if you see the Russian methods, they are mostly short-term methods, and Russia doesn't have, I don't think that they have really big idea for the region. I think that many of their methods are just buying time and making troubles until the things come to themselves, not because of their efforts, but because of parallel efforts of Chinese influence, of Turkish influence, and so on. So I don't think that, let's say, on short term, they will sit together and divide their spheres of influence. But I think that they know what's important for them in terms of especially the Chinese, and they will support activities of Russian soft power influence to the point when it suits them. And when they start to become contradictory, maybe they will start to undermine them. But that's just wild guess. It's really, really hard to say. But to conclude, I don't think that they will sit together and make a common strategy, but they will adjust according to the situation on the ground.
Anyone else care to comment on that?
Just I would like to support Marco's opinion. I don't think we can expect coordination of Russia's and China's activities in terms of them sitting behind a table and drawing maps and deciding on who's going where. But at the same time, I think they are quite careful about not crossing each other's paths. And there is a recent report by Royal Institute showing that their interests are quite complementary, at least in Serbia. So, and very rarely overlap. And I think that it's in both Russia's and China's interest to keep it this way, to avoid the competition in between them, because they see that it's mutually beneficial for them not to overlap and not to compete over interest, but rather keep their spheres of influence as they have them.
All right. Well, so sorry to be kind of glib, but the way I understand that is you expect them to be sort of friends with benefits, but nobody's getting married anytime soon. All right. We have a question that came in about critical infrastructure, and sort of with that, what there is a lot of at least in the ranking section of the report in the economy and technology portion, there's a lot of focus on 5G. Marco, you talked about it a little bit. Ivana touched on it as well. It jumped out at me the extent to which the report authors were that focused on 5G. Can you maybe update the audience a little bit about sort of where 5G is in each of these three countries, and at least to the best you're able to, your assessment of whether or not you see who you see being behind its actual establishment? We talked a little bit about Serbia in 2021, but where are we right now in North Macedonia and possibly in Bosnia in respect to its telecommunications infrastructure development, and who's going to be responsible for it?
Yeah, for North Macedonia, the process was quite closed until until recently, so not much information was available. I think that the government started to communicate this process and the telecom actually after the push from Trump and all this process that we should reconsider our approach towards Huawei. Currently, there is a statement from, and I'm talking 1 week or 2 weeks ago, from the Telecom, which, as I said before, is a subsidiary of the Deutsche Telekom and Magyar Telekom as middle. So they said that actually they're willing to follow the direction given from the government, and they are currently working with Huawei, and as they said that currently there is no regulatory framework that will prevent them from doing so. And taken from the statement, you see that if nobody said no to them, they will continue to do so. And on the other hand, the former minister for Information Society Administration, he said that actually the government is currently preparing a regulatory framework which will actually push out untrusted vendors. So I think that actually North Macedonia will align with recommendations from the US and NATO especially, and that process will be stopped. But it's really hard to see when the new procurement process will begin and so on. So it's way early to say that, I will say.
All right, I'm going to turn, we've had a number of questions, or at least a few come in regarding the media landscape. And, one viewer, has pointed out that, look, elections in the European Union are to varying degrees influenced by wealthy interests emanating from authoritarian states. And it's not something that's unique to the Western Balkans, but rather trying to underline that it's more broadly a phenomenon right now in a globalized economy. And in addition to that, Peter, I think you hit the nail on the head when and it was echoed by Ivana, that so much of this comes down to the extent to whether or not there's actually some skin in the economic game, if you will, and who, when there's a void, who's going to step up to the plate, if you will, and work with the private sector, or to the extent that it's a state-owned industry, but it's a critical industry. It's going to provide them with the necessary capital and other resources. And to the extent that anyone can comment on it, what is that possible, or is there a way to do that right now in respect to the media sector? Because we all recognize how it's an important, if not a fundamental vector when it comes to the influence of public opinion, one of the key topics in this report. But and one viewer has asked about CME acquisitions recently, and recognizing that there may still be a place for Western media companies to engage in Western Balkan markets, despite the fact that media is not generating the profits that it used to. And then on the other hand, we talked about Hungary and its engagement, at least in the North Macedonia media sphere. How can that play out? Do you right now see a space where if we're advocating that Western democracies engage economically in the region, is there room in the media sector for companies to be able to do that profitably?
I think it's a very important question, and yes, I think here the problem of small countries really make an important role. I think we could see in the last few years that that foreign media investors are ready to leave rather quickly. Bigger countries as well, such as Hungary, with a population of 10 million, if they do not see very profitable their activities. So I do think that probably I say it wrongly, but I do think that I mean, to counterbalance the media acquisitions of authoritarian countries, Western companies should be either supported or, let's say, have to think about some kind of subsidized model for operations. So I do not really see how they can very successfully operate and counterbalance this authoritarian let's say shift in the media market without direct state support. But I would be curious about what Ivana, Marco, and Barbara would think about that. And but I think the point of economies is generally rather important, because and that's I think in a lot of cases the obstacle of entering into the markets of these countries by Western companies as well, is that in a lot of cases they seem to be too small to generate a profit. Plus, I mean, the Western Balkans is still rather associated in many heads with the lack of stability that makes some investors, let's say, rather cautious. And I think this is what gives an advantage to China, Russia, and Turkey. But I think mostly China, that can, with really a small investment, can buy a lot of leverage. And at this point, I think we should really highlight the differences in the nature of Chinese and Russian influence in this region, because Russian influence is much more political, much more ideological than the Chinese one. I think generally we can talk about a shift of Chinese foreign policy under Xi in a more assertive, ideological, authoritarian direction. But what we could observe in the region, and I think this is what the report highlights, is that Chinese influence is much, let's say, less spectacular, much more pragmatic, much more following the pragmatic lies, direction of Deng Xiaoping's heritage than let's say, a very aggressive open foreign policy. So for that reason, I think if I should pick one and the most important challenge to the region when it comes to authoritarian influence, I think it's China, because I think China does in this region what China did quite successfully in Europe for rather decades.
Thank you. Well, if no one else has any comments in respect to the media question, I'm going to because that was an excellent segue to the last question we're going to take from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. But someone just asked the straight up question so come 2030, who's going to be the largest malign influencer in the Western Balkans region? And I think Peter pretty much gave us a sense where you might think that one is going, not to put words in Peter's mouth. But I'd like to hear from everyone, kind of, who do you see as being the primary actor or maleficent actor in that is outside of the region but coming into it in the next several years? Marco?
Oh, hard one. I would say if we take the region as an average, China maybe. But if we take North Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, I will not underestimate Turkey, especially since their soft power infrastructure is so embedded into our societies, and whenever they have the capability to utilize it if needed. It will be interesting how, for example, the region will position towards Turkey in context of the East Mediterranean conflict. That will, if North Macedonia sides with Greece, maybe that will really shift the Turkish approachment towards towards North Macedonia, which we will see the results several years from now. But yeah, on average, I will say China, but we should not underestimate Turkey.
Excellent, Marco. Thank you. Barbara?
Yeah, I again agree with Marco's view. And I would just like to add that several analysts has recently pointed out to rift occurring between Vučić and Putin. First, we could see some loosening of the alliance between Russia and Serbia during the COVID crisis, when China replaced Russia, at least in Vučić's discourse, as the closest friend of Serbia and so on. And then we could see similar developments after the elections in Serbia, and there were protests against the restrictions related to COVID, and Vučić accused Russia of interference in them, and there are some more signals showing that the Kremlin-Belgrade ties might be coming to some complications. And I think this can, if these assessments are correct, we can witness quite interesting shift in power balance in the region, which would play in the cards of China. So I think China is definitely one of the actors that will play a crucial role in the Western Balkans in the upcoming years. But I agree with the point that Turkey is not to be overlooked and underestimated. Its links to Bosniak politicians and also in North Macedonia or Kosovo are fairly vital leverage as well.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. Ivana? Oh, you have your mute's on. Your mute's on. Yeah.
I said that I absolutely, thank you. I said that I absolutely agree with all other speakers that we should not underestimate any of those actors. But I also agree that I think that China will become more and more prevalent actor in the region. Again, they have a very different strategy. Russia will remain invisible, malign influencer in the region. China will become, actually is becoming more and more visible influencer in the region, in the sense that they want to be visible as to perceive themselves as a true partners of the Balkans. But again, one thing that I worry about is about digital infrastructure that is not only an economic threat, but also a security threat. And I think one of the reasons why the United States has decided to be more involved in the region is exactly because of Chinese infrastructure in the region, because I think they understand how new technologies are important and the power of information, and how China has been using the Balkans, especially Serbia, as a lab to test their technologies.
Yes, those assessments, they all ring sound in various ways to me, and so much of it. In particular, yes, because I've worked, some of you may or may not know, I've worked on Turkey for almost 15 years in various capacities. I know the country, I dare say, intimately and watch it closely. And yes, there's a lot that's happening right now in respect to power dynamics in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere that are going to play out. And yes, Russia will continue to be as invisible as it may. And that will then bring us back to continuing questions, whether it's Russia, whether it's certain elements in Hungary, whether it's certain elements in Croatia, how non-state actors either do or don't cooperate with their states as they engage in these countries, and the extent to which, yes, there may not be a sort of a star chamber of bad people in Moscow and Beijing that get together and plot and plan and have their blueprint for what they're going to do in the Western Balkans. But rest assured that when those interests align and they feel that everything is copacetic, it will not spell anything good for those countries' integration in the transatlantic community, and certainly not for their democratic trajectories. I want to thank everyone for your time, your effort, and your remarks today, and helping raise a better awareness and understanding about what a vital part of Europe is up against as it goes forward, and hopefully becoming a greater part of not just European institutions, but as I keep coming back to, the importance of a broader transatlantic community and the economic prosperity, security, and equity that I believe, and I hope you do too, will bring to those countries, should they, with our assistance and our focused efforts, be able to continue on an upward trajectory in their democratic consolidations. Thank you all so much. To our viewers, thank you very much. And most of all, I would like to thank, in addition to the myriad of those organizations that contributed to this report, the National Endowment for Democracy, and their generous support in making this report and this event today happen. Thank you all. Please stay tuned to various publications and works that will come out from all of us in the future. We will continue to stay very focused on this subject. I wish you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.